Hey guys, Pastor Tanner here, coming at you with a not-so-fair-minded theological review video on the extremely difficult topic of Canaanite genocide in the Old Testament. Let me go ahead and show you the book that I reviewed. Now, this book is called Show Them No Mercy, with the subtitle God and Canaanite Genocide. This is obviously a tough topic with a lot of difficulties associated with it. I was eager to jump into it because I was hoping I would get a little bit more guidance for how to interpret these Old Testament issues. Now, I want you to know that there are a variety of perspectives within this book. And there was an overarching theme that I saw in the preface from the editor. It was this: all four authors, they say, start from the basis of acknowledging the authority and inspiration of the scriptures. On that theological foundation, there is no disagreement. So I was really excited to read this because I thought that every author was going to have this kind of same perspective. However, I was struck with essay number 1. Essay number 1 is written by C.S. Cowles, and it's called The Case for Radical Discontinuity. And I was struck because Cowles could hardly be described as within this tradition, at least as far as I'm concerned. Listen to some of the things Cowles said. Cowles said that Jesus intentionally edits the scriptures from Isaiah. Cowles says that the God revealed in Jesus would never be involved in genocide. Cowles says that Jesus introduced an entirely new way of looking at God. I'm sorry, but after I got done with this essay, I thought this cannot be a description of somebody who truly adheres to the authority of all of the Bible. He was basically editing the Old Testament scriptures and saying that these scriptures aren't actually representative of New Testament beliefs. I don't think that that's the case, and this is something that really bothered me about this essay. Because of that, when I rank each of the authors on the scale of most dismissive to least dismissive of the Canaanite genocide, I am sorry, but I had to put this radical discontinuity perspective as represented by Cowles at the far end of the spectrum. He's barely on the chart for me, okay? And I'm sure he would disagree with me, but the other authors within the book also pointed out the fact that Cowles was being very extreme in his approach. That said, I went ahead and clumped up all of the other authors together because they're much more close to one another in terms of how they view all of the Bible. One other thing that I want you to see when we get to this graph, on the scale of most dismissive to least dismissive, the two discontinuity perspectives actually occupy the extremes. We have radical discontinuity as the most dismissive, whereas I have moderate discontinuity as the least dismissive, with spiritual continuity and eschatological continuity somewhere in the middle. With that said, let me give you brief descriptions of each of the positions. The radical discontinuity perspective essentially says that we kind of have a different God in the Old Testament than what we have in the New Testament. There's the angry, wrathful, vindictive, violent God of the Old Testament contrasted with the loving, forgiving God of the New Testament. The spiritual continuity perspective says that we actually have here in the Old Testament a spiritual example set for ourselves. So what was going on physically in the Old Testament actually has a spiritual counterpart in the New Testament. The eschatological continuity perspective is very, very similar, but instead of having an eye to the spiritual continuity, it's focusing on the book of Revelation. The eschatological continuity perspective is very, very similar to spiritual continuity, but it focuses instead on David and this trajectory down through history, obviously leading into the book of Revelation. It's trying to point out the fact that this warfare that we have going on with Canaanite genocide is actually something representative of the last judgment at the end of time. Finally, the moderate discontinuity perspective takes this eschatological idea and cranks it up to 11. Why? Because the author suggests that this Canaanite genocide type of warfare, where everyone is devoted to destruction, will actually be reassumed in the end times. At the very end of times, we are actually going to see a very real and very physical destruction of all of God's enemies, similar to what we saw in the Old Testament. So you can see there's a lot of similarity between these last three perspectives, but their difference comes in the area of emphasis. Now that I've given you a broad framework, I want to spend the rest of the video talking about some of my favorite contributions from each author, even including Cowell's, and some of my questions for each author given their position and stance. Let's start with radical discontinuity. I actually really appreciated the emphasis in this essay on Christological hermeneutic. That is a way of reading the Old Testament with Jesus in mind, reading the Old Testament through our Jesus glasses. And Cowles brings this up time and time again. I really appreciated it. I thought he treated that concept very well, and I loved some of his comments associated with this. And so that was easily his best contribution. He said that Jesus brings a sea change in the New Testament when it comes to our understanding of God, and I actually couldn't agree more with that. My problem was with how dismissive he was of the Old Testament itself. He really does treat the Old Testament God as though he's radically different from the New Testament God. He treats the Old Testament God as though all he cares about is violent destruction, and this isn't the God that Jesus is preaching. But it's at this point that I thought Tremper Longman had a very fair-minded and solid critique. Let me show you what he had to say. Tremper Longman, in his critique of the radical discontinuity perspective, says this: "As I point out in my essay, the New Testament, when taken as a whole, is just as violent and bloody as, actually probably more than, the Old Testament." I think this represents the death knell for the radical discontinuity perspective. A fair-minded reading of the New Testament, including the book of Revelation, will see that there's just as much violence, there's just as much bloodshed, there's just as much of a strong emphasis on the destruction of God's enemies in the New Testament as in the Old Testament. And so I get the idea that we want to try and read two gods here. It makes it very clean to try and just break with the Old Testament, unhitched from the Old Testament, but in reality, I don't think it works. I think Tremper Longman actually points this out perfectly clearly, and the other authors had the same critique. I'm sorry, but this is a superficial way of treating the text, and this is, I think, where Cowell's perspective was the weakest. Is this really the same God that you're representing? Because the Bible seems to have the same consistency between the testaments that you don't even have in your framework. The second position presented in the book is the moderate discontinuity perspective by Eugene Merrill. And I already described what his position is. Let me tell you my favorite contribution from him. My favorite contribution from him has to do with the idea of the word that's specifically used of the warfare that it comes to when we're talking about Canaanite genocide. This is the Hebrew word cherem. Okay, and he brings this up explicitly. Notice that there are a lot of different ways that you can actually translate this word, but the most popular way, at least in the ESV, is to translate it devoted or devotees or devote. Okay, this is to put under a ban or dedicate something. And then the second most popular rendering is destruction. What Merrill says is that this actually represents the heart of what cherem warfare is all about. It's actually deicide, not genocide. His whole point is that this is about gods fighting against each other. This is inherently a religious battle, and it's not so much about the physical killing. That comes secondary, and the primary thing has to do with gods battling over each other for victory in the religious sphere. I thought this was really helpful because it kind of turns on its head what we find most distasteful about Canaanite genocide. We are so worried about the physical thing that's happening that we're not even considering the spiritual warfare that's going on. So I really like this contribution. Because of this, Merrill gives us a sense that we need to trust the text even without rational explanation. He doesn't try to explain it away. He doesn't try to rationalize it for our modern day minds. He just says, look, this is primarily a religious issue, and that's the road he goes down. But this leads into my primary critique and questions for Merrill. His treatment felt like an emotionless engagement with the topic. It's almost as though all of those deaths don't really matter, and I'm just going to focus on this from an academic perspective. But can we really do that when it comes to this issue of genocide? I mean, the whole reason it's a problem in terms of our discussions in apologetic matters or things like that is the fact that we are talking about wholesale murder here. Can we just really write it off as some sort of academic conclusion? My second critique for Merrill has to do with his resumption of this cherem warfare in the book of Revelation. If we are to resume this warfare in the future, how will you know when that time is here? You see, with those others who break from this discontinuity perspective that he promotes, we actually can see that for them, it's all done and there's no reason to do this ever again. But Merrill seems to think that this is going to be resumed sometime in the future. How will you know when? That's a really important question, because there are a lot of people who want to know about whether or not we're going to apply these verses more literally in the future. Moving on now to the third perspective, I want us to focus on the eschatological continuity promotion here. This is a really good viewpoint, and I want you to know it's very similar to the spiritual continuity perspective as well. Their differences are some of nuance, not of matter of kind, okay? Now, the eschatological continuity perspective promoted by Gard is actually one that tries to view this all in an end times judgment day type of perspective. So we are seeing in Canaanite genocide just a microcosm of what's going to happen in macrocosm at the end of time. And he tries to go to some very interesting passages in Kings and Chronicles and those areas where it's kind of promoting this idea that we see an end times perspective to the destruction of God's enemies. In this sense, he's sort of spiritualizing it like Longman is, but he's doing it more with this eschatological focus. I found this essay to be very good, and my favorite contribution from him came from the fact that he essentially said this: we are not to be judging ancient nations by our modern day standards. It is so easy in our day and age, in our tribalized political scheme, to actually judge all of ancient man, even just 100 years ago, by our modern day standards. They should have known better. Well, the only reason you know better is you live today. They didn't have the advantage of living today like we do. Okay? And so you need to understand the historical context in which each person is situated. This is especially true of these Old Testament texts. We're talking about people who lived thousands of years before our modern day times. We have the advantage of thousands of years of human development. We have the advantage of the New Testament and Christianity really gripping the hearts and minds of so many human beings down through history and transforming society. I think it is unfair to judge these early cultures by this standard, and Gard makes that point abundantly clear. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that what they did was okay, but what I am saying is that we need to actually have a bit of perspective here and stop just assuming in a whitewash fashion that everybody needs to adhere to the same level of morality that we have today. That's just unrealistic. Now, my critique of Gard is twofold. My first question is really about the lives of the individuals. Okay, great. You have an eschatological continuity perspective. It's all about the end times. Fantastic. But what about the people who lived there and then? What about those people whose lives were taken in order to demonstrate this larger eschatological perspective? What about them? Now, I know there is an answer to this that essentially says, well, all of us deserve God's judgment. We all deserve hell right now, but God graciously allows us to persist. If he had taken somebody's life in the past who deserved it, that's not wrong on him, and that's just wrong about us because we take sin too lightly. Don't get me wrong, I hear that, I resonate with that theologically, but there's something emotionally, there's something morally that feels wrong about somebody's individual life just being meant to kind of be imagistic of the future. My second question for Gard has to do with his framework or his structure. Like I said, he takes Kings, Chronicles, all of those types of books to be sort of binding in terms of setting up our structure. But why should we take Chronicles, for example, as the framework by which we understand everything? Seems to be a little arbitrary to me, and while it sets up a nice systematic framework, I don't think it's actually warranted by the text itself. Finally, let me get to Tremper Longman and the spiritual continuity perspective. His best contribution was this illustration that he gave towards the end of his essay about a detective novel. Listen to what he says. He says, I have found helpful an analogy with a detective novel. A detective novel is filled with hints and clues pointing to the one who committed the crime. In a well-written example of this genre, however, readers will not be sure who the culprit is until it is revealed by the expert sleuth at the very end. However, if one were to go back and read the beginning again, it would be with a fuller understanding. all the clues and hints would make more sense in the light of the knowledge of the end. One could never read the beginning of the story quite the same. And this holds true for the Christian reader of the Old Testament who now knows the surprise end of the story. I thought this was such a helpful picture because what he's essentially saying is that in the Old Covenant, in the Old Testament, we have visible pictures and stories that are actually meant to be later more fully revealed in a spiritual way. This is very, very consistent with my own hermeneutic and understanding of the Old Testament relationship to the New Testament, and so I really resonated with this point. However, for Longman, I also have two questions. I think he falls under that same question that I struck at guard with. What about the people who lived during that time? Okay, you've got this detective novel, right? But does that warrant the killing of all of these supposedly innocent lives? Does that warrant the taking away of all of these people's future just so we could set up a good novel, just so that we could have a nice surprise ending? That seems a little bit difficult to take when it comes to our gut level check with the scriptures. Not only that, but there's also the question of the grammatical historical and the literal hermeneutic. There is a big focus in conservative Christian circles on authorial intent, and Tremper Longman seems to throw authorial intent out the window. Is that warranted, and are we ready to take the ramifications that may come from taking a more typological perspective on the Old Testament? With my best and worst contributions of each author spelled out, I actually now want to show you my position. After reading everything, this is where I fall, right in that spiritual continuity and eschatological continuity perspective. These are the ones that line up most with my hermeneutics. It made a lot of sense to me, and I really do think there is a positive understanding of recognizing that we have a material story in the Old Testament that takes on spiritual significance in the New Testament. However, there are some problems associated with this that I think we still need to wrestle with. Look, it's clear to me that in the Old Testament, we have stories that God has given us that are actually representative of a spiritual truth or reality in the New Testament. The way I get to this is by looking at the Exodus. In the Exodus, we have God taking his people out of bondage or slavery in Egypt, and then they travel through the wilderness until they reach the Promised Land. This seems to me to be so much in line with the Christian's trajectory as he is taken out of the bondage of slavery to sin, and he travels now on his pilgrim's progress towards the Promised Land, heaven. So I see this trajectory represented in the scriptures. However, we have to do a couple of things in order to understand this. One, we can say that the literal history really did happen, but it was representative of a larger truth, and that's actually the position I take. Or we have to say that all of the Old Testament is allegorical or has some sort of anagogical perspective here. Now, I know that there are people who take that latter response, and don't get me wrong, that's pretty easy to do, because once you spiritualize all of the Old Testament in that way, you say it's all allegory, now you don't have to answer for the judgmental, hateful, vindictive God of the Old Testament. After all, these are all just stories. They're metaphors. But I don't think that does justice to the way that the Old Testament stories themselves are presented. They seem to be presented in a historical narrative fashion, and so I think it's a cop-out to just say they're all spiritualized. So I believe that these things truly happened in history, but they also represent greater spiritual truths. But if they truly happened in history, how do we still account for this genocidal God? Now, I will say at this point that this may not be fully satisfying to people who would disagree with me. But when I have read Barfield and I have understood how mankind has changed over time, I truly believe that is how God is acting with humanity in the world. Barfield talks about the trajectory, how in the Old Testament, man was of a more primitive nature, if you will, that he was spiritually dulled. And as we have grown and established our understanding of these more spiritual realities and these spiritual truths, God could speak to us in more abstract ways. Now, I don't buy everything in that program, but it's something like the wedding of Tremper Longman and Owen Barfield that has made me a little bit more comfortable with this topic. I'm not saying I have all of the answers. I'm not saying I'm completely comfortable with it. But when I take that perspective that, okay, ancient man differed radically from modern man, And therefore, God, even though he never changes, adapts to how man changes over time. Plus, it has a spiritual trajectory that has made me mostly comfortable with dealing with this topic. I still have a lot of sympathy for people who can't go that far, but I think approaches like Cowell's approach to just essentially detach from the Old Testament actually do more harm than good. This is something that I think is still open for discussion, and I think a spiritual understanding puts us on the right path, but I don't think it answers the question entirely. Hopefully this video has been helpful for you on a very difficult topic, and I look forward to reading your comments below. Take care. God bless. Bye.